Today on the Workplace Makers podcast, we welcome Cris Popp, who is here with me, and he is everything you would want in an advisor on culture and change in the hybrid work era. He has an impressive CV of clients whom he's worked with to combine positive psychology with productivity and create sustainable peak performance workplaces. He's done everything from found an Australian based biotech firm to being an ABC journalist and multiple media appearances, and somehow acquiring, I think it's 7, Cris, postgraduate qualifications in everything from e-commerce and business to the arts. So even more than that, he's lived his own experience of remote and hybrid team leadership, which we'll talk more about shortly. But Cris, welcome to the show. Great to have you here. And you're joining us today from Melbourne, is that right?
That's right. Thanks, Nina. Thanks for having me. A very grey and wet Melbourne, as people know it, but as we also believe in Melbourne, the capital of Australia.
Yeah, nice. Absolutely. I remember that question in year 5 at school, and I think I wrote that Sydney was the capital because I lived in Sydney at the time. So,
Right, as you do.
yeah, as you do. It sounds from your background there that we just talked about all these areas of interest that you have professionally, and that's really taken you to a wide range of different experiences, I guess, and areas of study. So, how is it that you developed this broad interest, and what took you to each of those experiences?
Each of those, well, it's kind of a personal story, and I'll cut it short for your listeners. But I was a miserable person, git for a very long time, and I kept
Yeah.
on thinking, geez, it would be good to be happier. And so I started reading these self-help books. In fact, the first one was Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman, who went on to be, yeah,
Fantastic.
went on to become the head of the
Mm,
American Psychology Association and change the direction of psychology from looking at what goes wrong to how do we thrive. So that
mm,
kind of was happening on the side, and while that was happening personally, I was also doing a lot of leadership development with Mount Eliza Business School and Melbourne Business School and other places, and I started to I wanted to give people things that were really effective, so I wanted to do things that I had tried, and so I started to talk about that, and you could see people taking notes when you talked about, how could you become more optimistic or how you'd become happier. And so that's how the two came together and eventually led to the main thing that I do now, which is the hybrid leadership, leading hybrid teams, and workplace wellbeing.
yeah, brilliant. And it is interesting how that's all of those that variety of experiences now led you to this hybrid work and hybrid
Mm.
team focus. And you've got your own experience of remote team leadership and working with technology and connecting people across distance. So can you tell us a little bit
Mm.
about that? What was that like, and how did that
I was
arise?
I was sort of, I guess, lucky or unlucky. But to say in 1997, 8, 24 years ago,
Yeah.
I got a job with this startup company in Melbourne called Look Smart. And the founders
Nice.
had just come back from New York and they just discovered this thing called the internet. And on the internet, you could do things like buy a pizza by looking online. And so they
Mm,
needed people to, and at that point, the model for a search engine was that you would categorize every single website in the world because there weren't as many back then. And I had this job as an
mm,
editor to kind of go out and find sites and I would write a review about them. Anyway, I remember starting that job. I had writing skills, so that's why I got the job. And leaving one day, and there were all these people. It was like 6:30 or 7 at night. It was getting dark. There were all these people doing things on their computers, and I'm like, "What are you doing at this time of night on your computer?" And they said, "Oh, they're chatting to other people on other sides of the world." And I was like, "What? What? How do you chat to people on the other side? And why would you do that?" And they said, "Oh, just in developing the business, they've become friends." I'm like, why would you become a friend with someone in Texas? Or not, sorry, not singling out Texas, but anywhere in the world. And so that was my first experience of working with teams all over the world, and that led to a bunch of others. I had my own overseas staff in quite a while. I had IT staff and local staff, and initially found that very hair raising. Went to visit them once overseas. That was kind of fun. And
mm,
at the same time, I was doing the leadership training, and I started to have to adapt my own leadership style to the hybrid world.
Mm,
And one of the things
mm,
about hybrid leadership, one of the researchers shows you can rely less on charisma. Now, if you met me, you probably don't think I have any charisma anyway. But what it means is that leaders have to actually perform better in hybrid environments than they could get away with in the physical environments. And so I had to adapt. And
mm.
that's kind of, and then we had a startup and we used remote staff, and then of course lockdown happened. So it's 24 years, probably tightened a lot or focused a lot in the last sort of 7 to 8. When you discover that you get people working anywhere in the world with a much lower cost base than here. And I remember being in
Yeah,
Thailand and meeting this guy, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I write." And I'm like, "Well, where do you live?" He goes, "Oh, wherever wherever I like." And he was,
yeah.
yep,
Digital
yep,
nomad,
yep,
we now call them. Yeah, yeah. And so for you, that just felt like a completely, I guess, adventurous experience. I'm putting words in your mouth, but it sounds like you were really writing the book as you go on how do I do this leadership
yep.
for people working across the
It was a
world.
bit more desperate than
Yeah,
that. It was like I was annoying my staff and things weren't working well. And so I had to stop and
yeah,
reflect and think, what are you doing? So it was a bit more like, oh,
yeah,
I'm going to lose them. And they're very hard to get good staff, of course. So
yeah. And just so we can conceptualize that, which countries were your
mostly
staff
the
in? Where were
Philippines, but
you
I've had
talking
them
to?
Kenya, Pakistan, UK, and I worked with an IT company, and I think they were all in somewhere like Laos. But before that, it was even in Australia. I
Wow.
had my first PA. I've met once, but I've known her for like 15 years now, and she lives in Foster. Uh, I
Oh,
remember
yeah,
once I was driving
brilliant.
through, and
Yeah,
she came and had lunch with me, but that was the only time we've ever met. Mm.
amazing. Yeah, isn't that cool? And do you think that's happening more now? Do you think that there are more people in business have relationships like that? I know that's
Mm.
how I work with one of my team members. We've worked together for 2.5 years. We've actually never been in the same room or within 100 meters of each
Wow,
other, never met
that's
in
interesting.
person. Yeah. Well, it's like you. So I think there's a bunch of
Yeah.
people doing that. There's more of us who are realizing that this is really a
Yeah,
valid
the
a
first challenge
valid
I had with
option.
that was, how do I give Christy a present? And so I remember ringing up the local restaurants and saying, "Here's my credit card. I'm going to give you this much money. When this person comes in, can you deduct it off my
Yeah.
credit card?" That was my first primitive attempt at giving
Nice.
someone somewhere else a Christmas bonus. Mm,
Love it. That's fantastic. I love it. You found a
mm,
creative way. That's very cool. And so in terms of the work you're doing with hybrid leadership and taking people on that journey of how they can lead their hybrid teams effectively, I just wonder what was the moment when you realized there's really a need for better training beyond what
mm,
you could access and thinking more about the market and out there and other business leaders and people in corporate,
mm.
potentially in that
It was
corporate
really
world now.
the first
Mm,
lockdown where it really kind of came home when I had a commercial directive
mm,
from a pharmacy company saying, "Can you do something with my sales staff?" Because salespeople generally extroverted and high energy,
mm.
and now they were going to be locked at home, and they actually wanted to
Yeah.
keep them engaged, but they also wanted to keep them working. And so just working with them. And when they were going into an office and working, I guess externally, there's a discipline that's informed. It's forced on you. For example, you've got to visit 12 pharmacies in this amount of time, or so many clients. But when you suddenly come working from home, they didn't have that same discipline. So I began by talking about how do you set up a
Mm.
really effective routine for yourself. And I'd been doing it for a long time, so I had it down pat. I knew all the traps. So really started to come together then, and then things emerged like leaders not connecting with things like poor camera hygiene. And what do I mean like that? I don't know if you've been on those calls and everyone's looking down at the screen, not at the camera, and you think, oh, no one's paying attention to me. And so really, really, and bad sound and bad light, and then not knowing how to check in with people, not knowing whether it was okay to
Mm.
ring someone up and check things. It just started to, I guess, emerge from that. So probably about 3 years it would be now that it started to come up.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds
Mm,
appropriate. That sounds like the right timing, we had this challenge with COVID, and it's probably
mm,
been 2.5 years now that people have been dealing with it, and that drove a new level of need around connecting remotely. And so that's a really great opportunity to ask you what you're discovering people are mistakes that people are making. So what are the big practical problems that leaders are facing? What are you noticing that's starting to appear in terms of
mm.
what they're doing wrong? I guess what are the mistakes that
Yeah.
that
Well, because,
leaders can
when it
avoid?
first happened, we noticed some great
Yeah.
things. People thought that innovation would decrease, but in fact, it's increased, and it's to do with the way our brains work. People
Mm,
are not less productive, but more productive. I call these the myths. People needed to be monitored, but in fact, they thrive on autonomy. And that the culture will decay, but in fact, it's spread, and in some ways, it's spread more evenly. So that that was great for the
mm,
workplace, and then staff. I think it was something like 86% liked working from home. 75% said they had improved productivity, and 60% said they could focus on their health more, and almost 60% say, I like it so much that if you don't give it to me, I'll look for another job. It's pretty high.
yeah, yeah, huge, isn't it? That's a
Yeah.
really high
So
number.
the traps that
Mm,
first were emerging, they're kind of changing again. So I'm going to give. I've got this five that come up, and that basically they're all still there, but their sequence has kind of changed a little bit. So the first one that came up,
mm,
that comes up in a big ways, and I was talking with the client about this today, was creeping unfairness. So there's a sense that
mm,
people start to build that your team or your leadership is unfair, and it comes across in two ways. One
mm,
is the opportunity, so that and there's a couple of biases that cause that. One's proximity bias, and one's availability bias. And these are just shortcuts that you
mm,
make in your mind. And so the proximity bias is that you tend to favour people and things that are closer to you, that you tend to see around a lot. And the
mm,
availability bias is you tend to go to things that are easily available. So those two are coming in, and
mm,
most of the time they're useful shortcuts for navigating the world, but in the hybrid they're unfair, they're unsafe, they backfire. And so what happens is you've got to be really careful as a leader to both give opportunities really evenly, and also to let people. There's two
mm,
places come up. So giving opportunities in recognition and in meetings, and to let people contribute really evenly. And I worked
mm.
many years ago in this great office. We had a really interesting director. His name was Lance. He was a very action kind of guy. He loved doing stuff. He had lots of great ideas, and he always wanted things implemented pretty quickly. And right outside Lance's office sat
Yeah,
Bob, and I know both these guys. And so Lance would get a brilliant stroke of idea, and he'd come out, and the first person he'd see would be
yeah.
Bob, and he'd go, Bob, let's sign up with some partners in Tokyo. Go over there. Or Bob, we need a new procurement database. And Bob was always looking startled and like, oh my God, more work. But we were all thinking,
Yeah.
Bob is Lance's favorite. If you want to get something to Lance, talk to
Mm,
Bob about it. And so Bob had people coming over and saying, can you
mm.
tell me how you think Lance would respond to this? Or can you put a word in for me? Bob, of course, is getting pretty frustrated with the whole thing. But proximity bias, right
Yes.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect example. Absolutely
Creeping
so true.
unfairness.
So that's
Yeah.
creeping unfairness. That's a good, really powerful point. And because that unfairness really undermines
I
engagement
can't
quite
remember the exact
significantly,
number, but
doesn't it?
it's sort of, I think that the 60% more likely, if someone perceives it as unfair, they're 60% more likely to take sick
Mm.
leave, and something similar around trying to find another job.
Interesting.
It's a huge innate issue.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm. No, that's good. Thank you. And I know you've got more here, and this is gold. So,
Well,
yeah, what are the other big mistakes that people
well,
are
the
making that are
others
starting
are
to appear?
I'll say them and I'll run through them. So meetings will get worse. I've also written they might get better. Silo
Mm,
teams, flex work perceived as a right, and hybrid hesitancy from leaders.
mm,
So maybe not quite in that order, but so the next
mm.
thing I'm sort of noticing at the moment is this perception of being able to work flexibly or from home is a right. So back in the day, Nina, if you worked in an office and you had to get the fridge delivered, when would you do it? On the weekend, perhaps
On
in
the
the evening
weekend.
or early in the morning, so you'd go to work afterwards. Now, I was talking to a client a few
Hmm.
weeks ago, and we're having our team meeting on Thursday. Oh no, I can't meet you at 1 o'clock because the fridge is getting delivered. What was the other one? My friend was on a call with
Mm.
someone, and she was at work, and she said, "Oh, sorry, let me call you back." I think it was a call center. The dog groomer is here now.
Oh, wow. That's almost like
It
a
is
cartoon right there,
dog
isn't it?
groomer.
That's a
Uh,
stereotypical. You're just
Yeah,
having a
work time.
laugh, right?
To
This is
make it
work
worse, I think
time.
it might have
Yeah.
been one of those COVID lines where they call you to see how you're doing at home. It might have been like that.
Yeah.
So she got to the dog groomer and came back and finished the call. So the one that I'm starting to notice is this battle, this tug of war between staff for autonomy and the leadership for
Mm,
control. And
mm,
the more people have been allowed
mm,
to, have their flex work, the less they're wanting to, it's become
mm.
perceived as a right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting,
Mm.
isn't it? It's almost crept up. It's almost like a by force
Yep.
of numbers, by sheer numbers, people have recognized that, oh, they're not necessarily getting any negative repercussions for operating as if they had, let's say, complete flexibility, or a much higher degree of flexibility than before. And so they've kind of
Mm.
dug in a little, I think, in some
Yeah,
cases,
you
saying,
can't
well,
take
we
this
don't
away
want to
from
lose
me,
this now.
and getting angry about it. So that used to be my number four, but that's kind of at number two now. So the unfairness, the right. In fact, I'd probably say it's
Yeah.
probably getting closer to number one. So you got flex as a right, creeping unfairness, um, and then you've got
Mm,
meetings. Now there is some good news about meetings, and the good news is that the stats show that the amount of time we spend in meetings has decreased. So in more meetings, there's slightly more people in them, but they're shorter. And the overall amount of time, I think it was about 20% was the number, that we're spending less time in meetings. So that's kind of good. So that's the up. But the worse is that people in meetings, it's proving quite difficult for leaders to get people to engage sometimes. So, again, talking to someone today, and she turned up for a
mm,
performance conversation with the person that they were having it with. It was just a regular check-in, it was nothing,
mm.
and they wouldn't put on the camera. And, and so,
Ah,
well,
wow. So something like that.
this is your
Mm,
manager, and it's a pretty important conversation. And that's not
mm,
alone. In other situations, you're looking around and you say, who's got any ideas or solutions for XYZ, and it's met with silence or people just
mm.
looking out at the cameras. So meetings
Yeah.
getting have gotten shorter, and the upside though with meetings has been there does seem an opportunity for more equal contribution because you've got to take turns, which means that the extroverts,
Mm,
the loud people, have to sit back and let everyone have a go. But it does mean that the leader has to actively facilitate the meeting.
mm. Yeah, exactly, and that's drawing
Yeah.
on facilitation skills that the people up to this point haven't needed to do quite so much, because body language often has indicated whether someone was,
Yep.
ready to shift topic. So, and yeah, okay, we're moving on. I'm not interested now in what you're saying. And so people will take a cue from the leader and kind of fall into
Yeah.
more of a turn taking kind of pattern. But I think that's such a good point that that active facilitation, it
Mm.
is a real skill, and it's something that
Yep.
leaders do well to develop
Yep.
in this
There's a,
way of
there's a
working.
method called the Delphi
Mm,
method, and if your listeners email me, maybe we'll give them the address afterwards. I'll send them a link to an article about how
great.
to use it, and it's been around a long time, but it's really come into its own with hybrid meetings. Cool.
Brilliant.
So
It's a
number
great
three, meetings
resource. Thank
getting
you.
worse. Flexes are right. So the other ones I'm seeing is siloed teams. That's number four. And
Mm,
what I mean by siloed teams is that what's happened is our weak ties. So what we mean by weak ties. So you have strong ties with the people in your team, but you might have a weak tie with the people up in
mm,
payroll or Sam, who's over in accounting or logistics, but you happen to both
mm,
get your coffees at the same time when you're face to face, and so you've got a bit of a relationship with them.
mm.
And so it's what we've seen after 2.5 years is that the bonds within teams are strong, but the bonds between teams
Yeah.
are breaking down a bit. And the solution to that
Yeah.
one is, there's all this talk about
Yeah.
what days you're going to be in the office, because a lot of organisations have gone to some hybrid mix of 2 or 3 days in the office. So, can you get your team in the office on a day with another team that you don't normally have much to do with?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great way to do it.
Yeah,
Absolutely. That co-location is a this is where the space does play a really key role in
yeah.
the overall picture of
That's
how does
something
the
you do a lot of
workplace
work
work.
with, Nina. I think
Mm.
is about creating a space where there are those
Mm.
opportunities to bump into someone.
Yeah.
Mm,
How does the space factor into what I call a workplace model? So how does the workplace, which is this current space
mm,
plus other spaces and the ways we work in between those spaces, how does all of that come together to create something that's an
mm,
enabler of great work, good productivity, engagement, all that good people stuff that we're looking for. And it does mean thinking across the
mm,
people outcomes and the space, and involving a few different
mm,
parts of the business to achieve that.
mm.
But yeah, there's a huge opportunity in that once people start realizing that the workplace itself and working from home and our ways of working in between
Yeah.
it can be a really powerful enabler. Yeah, so good. I love that point about the strong ties and the weak ties, and yeah, what leaders can do about that
It is.
is
Look, there's other things they can
co-location's the
do. Like
easiest
I had
solution.
one leader
Mm,
I know, and she had the, I guess, the power to do this. She would drop in on team meetings of her
mm,
teams, if you like. So the direct reports, she had her own team, and she had like
mm,
20, so it would take 3 months to go around,
mhm,
but she would just pop in to their Zoom meetings
mm,
of the and she wouldn't surprise, it was all arranged, it wasn't sort of sneaking up, and that was just one way of building up those
mhm,
weak ties a little bit.
yeah. And the difference
Yeah,
there is really becoming intentional, isn't it? It's that
yeah.
intention, it's a plan, it's actually realizing what's missing
Yeah,
here and doing
which is,
something
which is not
deliberate
lovely
to address
segue, and I
that.
know you didn't mean it, into our last
Mm.
point, which was that
No, I
so,
didn't. I didn't know.
well, so about just about being
Tell us
intentional.
the
So
last one
so what's
again. Sorry,
always
I missed
set
that.
apart um, more able than less able leaders, that's a nice way to put it, is that are often more able. Well, sometimes they're just
Mm,
innately good at it, but often they do a bit of reflection. So back in the pre-COVID physical times, um, even good leaders back then were reflecting, but leaders that were not as skilled didn't need to do that as much because they could
mm,
manage, by walking around or by looking at people, and you were judged by how often you were sitting there. So what's happened with hybrid, where you can't see your
mm,
people anymore, is it's accentuated those differences. Which brings us to the last one, which is an emergent trap I'm seeing. This is what I call hybrid hesitancy from leaders. Leaders are a little bit uncomfortable about the hybrid world. Maybe if my team gets on without me, they don't really need me. Maybe the organization will know that. And it's a little bit scary. And so they might
Mm.
be hesitating about leading, having a hybrid workplace. And if they are, because what we're having now is a lot of HR managers have to implement this the hybrid flexible work arrangements. If they are, they could be unconsciously probably
Mm.
sabotaging the move to a flex workplace without even meaning to. Just sort of, what is my job
Mm.
if I'm not there, if people don't need me? Because one of the things I talk about in the hybrid leadership method, the program I teach, is that you want to develop self-managing staff, and you want to judge people on results only work. So self-managing staff
Mm.
and results only work, and it shouldn't matter where or when
Mm.
that work happens, as long as it happens. Yeah,
Mm. And what is
yeah.
the role for the leader in that picture? Because that's just to address that concern
So
that
I
where
get them to
people might
think,
feel like,
of course,
well,
come to the
what's my
program
role
and learn
now?
all about it. But the three central questions you can take away right now are: in any leadership
Mm.
action you do with regard to your team, you can ask yourself these three questions. By doing this, am I inspiring them? Am I empowering them? Or am I holding them accountable? Am I inspiring my people, getting them wanting to do things? Am I
Mm.
empowering them, giving the ability, the autonomy, the freedom to do that? And am I holding them accountable afterwards, which is often the bit that people find hard.
Yeah. And tell us more. How do you equip people
Yep.
in the
Yep.
training to
So
be able to do
one
these
of the
three
things, so
things with their
inspiring is really
staff?
around motivating people. People, people like working with a leader who gives us stuff about them. I'll use clean language, and it's not that hard to
Yeah.
do. Years ago, I was giving a talk in Sydney, and I was flying out the
Mm.
next day, and the night before, I went to this funky restaurant in Melbourne called the Veggie Bar. And it's very hip and cool. I'm not particularly vegetarian, but anyway, for some reason we were there. And as
Mm.
we were waiting in the queue to get served, taken to our table, this waiter bounced over. And she's really bouncy and lively and full of energy. And I just thought, I wonder why she seems like she really likes working. And I said, "What's it like working here?" And she goes, "Oh, it's great. It's great. I really love this place. It's really terrific. Um, it's great to come in here. I trained as an Auslan. She was saying I trained as a Auslan interpreter, and I started working here through university, and I don't have to work anymore, but I just like coming in." I'm like, "Oh, that
Oh,
was
wow.
pretty surprising." Young person. I'm thinking, why wouldn't you be out on Friday night having fun?
Oh,
And I said, "What makes it so good?" She goes, "Oh, I think, the managers, just
yeah.
the owners really care about you." And I go, "Well, how do you know?" She said, "Oh, when they ask you how you are, they wait for the answer. They listen for the answer."
Wow,
Yeah,
something so simple, isn't it? Yes. Amazing. Gosh. Like, and with that, you just realize that there's potentially all these moments throughout the day and throughout the
yeah,
week that leaders can take once they're aware of them
yeah.
to build
Yeah,
that
it does
sense
require a bit of
of
look. Most
connection,
leaders are
essentially.
good people and they want to do the right thing. They're caught up with getting work done,
Mm.
and they're thinking about that. And the more time I spend on something else, talking
Mm.
to you about your kid's footy game, the less it is for that. So they're coming from a good place. They just need to sort of reframe it, because in the
Mm.
physical world, you didn't need to inspire people. You could manage them by your presence. You didn't need to empower them. You were always on hand to help when they needed something, and you
Mm.
didn't need to hold them accountable as much because you could measure by their visibility. They're sitting at the desk, Jack's over there, that's his accountability. In
Mm.
this hybrid world, you no longer have access to that, so
Mm.
you've got to want people to want to do things. And look, that's the way things were going even before hybrid came anyway.
And there's great benefits to managing that accountability piece really well, isn't there? Around understanding the actual
Yeah,
outputs of the work and being able to prove productivity and really actually understand whether something's
yeah,
working or not because you're taking more of a data based approach. So, yeah, I guess for me that's a really positive flip side for organizations and for leaders is that actually this way of working does
yeah,
really bring into
yeah,
focus whether things are working well or whether they're not working well. Whether your team's
yeah.
functional,
There
productive,
was this thing called
engaged,
discretionary effort,
or whether they're
right? So we
not.
used to
Um,
not talk about that. When you're I don't
mm,
know, fixing tires or you're on a production line, uh, there's a little bit of discretionary effort, but you need to be there using
mm,
the tools, and so there's not as much difference between when you give discretionary effort or not. But when you're, say, writing a policy or developing a strategy or trying to solve a problem, your brain doesn't go, "I've left the office. I'm going to stop thinking about it now." It's like tuned on, and you'll know that every time you've woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so,
no.
so what the hybrid, what we're unleashing here is
Mhm.
people's discretionary effort, the effort they don't need to give, but that is latent talent, and it's sometimes it's as simple as asking them what they think about how to solve things, etc. But that's where the big productivity gain is going to come from.
Mm, yeah, that's a good point too, because we've been
Mm,
talking about workforce productivity for 25 years or more, haven't we, across OECD countries and across the world,
mm,
where just how are we going to get to greater
yeah,
productivity has been a really widespread question. So, yeah, this is
yeah.
a potentially a
There's a great study
significant
done. So one of the
step
things about
change that
hybrid
can
work is people
deliver
have more
some of
autonomy,
that.
and autonomy is hugely motivating. And there was a great study that was done
Mm.
where you might want to, I'll ask you to guess the number, but they let one group decorate their cubicles and another one not, and they measured the increase in productivity. Do you want to hazard a guess of how much difference it made? Well, a bit over 25% more
I'd say about
productivity
40%.
simply by being able to decorate your cubicle.
Right.
Huge. Quarter. It's like an extra day and a half a week.
Yeah. Fantastic. Love Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
25% and it's just something so simple. I love that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I've got to
I
get
can
hold
send
of
it to
that
you.
study, Chris. You got to tell me more about that so I can find it. I think that's
Yeah.
gold. And yeah, because people, what it does is gives people control. And when people have control, they feel less
Yeah.
stressed. They feel that they've had choice. They feel respected. So it's given, and that
Yeah.
personalization, that ticks the belonging box. And
Yeah.
yeah,
For the boffins
there's
out
a
there,
huge amount in that,
have a look
as
at
minor as it might
self-determination
seem.
theory by Richard Ryan. I hope I don't sound him too pretentious. Self-determination theory, and that research on the cubicles was uh, published by a BBC article, and the author was David Rock, 2021. But I can see if I can find the reference.
Oh, great. Amazing. Very cool. No, that's probably given me enough. That's great. We will put that in the show notes so anyone can follow that up who wants to. And also your email address there so people could reach out and
Yeah.
get these 5 leadership mistakes that you've talked about.
Oh, the Delphi method.
Um,
That's what I was
and
saying.
then you
So
also mentioned something
you want me to
earlier, that
spell the email
the
address out?
Delphi method. Mm.
Great.
We,
So it's
we can
just
even,
Chris with
yeah,
no
you can do
H.
that
That's
now, and we'll add it to the show
CRIS
notes as well.
at
That'll be lovely.
chrispopp.com, which is CRIS at CRISPOPP.com. CRIS at CRISPOPP.com. And maybe a final thing for leaders to think about, is it worth doing all this development? People are getting
Brilliant.
along all right, etc. 70% of the variance in your team's performance comes down to the leader. Repeat that. 70% of the variance between two different teams will be the leader.
Mm. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I recognize that stat because that came from Gallup, didn't it? And it was one of their
Yeah.
most profound findings. They said over the decades that they've been collecting data, they hadn't had anything as striking or as consistent
Yeah.
or as robust as that. And they themselves were completely surprised that it could come down to one factor, and that is who's the leader of a team. So yeah, I think that's a great way to round off the conversation about hybrid. And before you go, just to understand um, you a little bit more, Cris, and the person
Favorite
who we've
meal?
been
Oh,
speaking
I
with,
just
what is
discovered this
your favorite
fantastic
meal
mung bean
to cook or
recipe.
eat? I ask everyone this question.
Mung beans, I know.
Oh, mung
No,
beans?
I didn't
Are
either.
you kidding
But
me?
it's like
That's
it's got
I
like
can't believe that
a
anything
whole
tasty
one and
could
a
come
half
from mung
handfuls of
beans.
garlic, a whole piece of ginger. It's an Indian recipe. Lots of coconut milk, lots of tomato, and I kind of been wanting to cook a bit more with vegetables because it's good for the
Wow.
environment. And there's lots of cows. There's a cow out there that's going, oh yeah, eat mung beans, Cris. It's better than beef.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a current
Yeah.
favorite. Mm, will do.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, if you're willing to share the recipe, we'll add that to the show notes as well, because that's
Thank you.
yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us on the Workplace Makers podcast. Brilliant to have you, and yeah, just great to be able to delve into all of these really relevant issues